Not everything, but enough. Neighbors disappeared overnight, and their apartments were suddenly occupied by strangers who never explained what had happened to the previous tenants. Trains arrived and departed from stations at regular intervals, packed with people carrying suitcases who never returned. And railway workers and ticket sellers and conductors processed these transports as routine logistical operations without asking where the passengers were going or why they never came back. Smoke rose from facilities on the outskirts of cities, carrying smells that residents learned not to discuss in public spaces or even in private conversations with friends and family, who might repeat what had been said to the wrong people. Rumours spread through whispered conversations and disappeared letters, and the sudden silence of people who'd been active in their communities and who were suddenly gone without explanation or farewell. And still, life went on. Markets remained open, and people bought groceries and discussed weather and complained about rationing and attended concerts and films and went to work and raised children and celebrated holidays and maintained the routines and rituals of ordinary existence, as if the disappearances and the rumours and the smoke and the silence were simply background conditions that required no particular response or moral reckoning. The question that haunts historical examination of this period is not whether people knew, because the evidence demonstrates conclusively that millions of ordinary citizens had access to enough information to understand that something catastrophic was happening to targeted populations, but rather why that knowledge produced so little resistance or even private moral distress. Why people who possessed fragments of truth that should have demanded investigation and action instead chose to look away and to continue with their lives as if the atrocities occurring around them were none of their concern. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today, we examine the psychology of complicit silence, exploring the specific mechanisms through which ordinary people rationalize their failure to respond to atrocity occurring in their immediate environment. Analyzing how social pressure and fear and the human capacity for selective attention and moral disengagement can create conditions where millions of people can know enough to be morally implicated while maintaining internal narratives of innocence and powerlessness that allow them to avoid the psychological costs of genuine moral confrontation with their own complicity. The myth that ordinary citizens of Nazi Germany were genuinely ignorant of the Holocaust collapses when examined against the historical evidence of how much information was actually available and how many people had direct or indirect exposure to that information through their daily lives and through their participation in the systems that made genocide logistically possible. The systematic deportation of millions of people required the cooperation and knowledge of railway workers who scheduled and operated the trains, of bureaucrats who processed the paperwork and maintained the records, of neighbours who watched apartments being emptied and who moved into those apartments or purchased the possessions left behind, of soldiers returning from the Eastern Front who had witnessed or participated in mass shootings, of factory workers who produced the materials and equipment used in camps, of residents living near facilities whose function became increasingly obvious through the constant arrivals and the smoke and the smell and the complete absence of departures. The psychological defense that we didn't know operates through a sophisticated form of motivated ignorance, where people actively avoid confronting information that would create moral obligations they are unwilling to fulfill. where they construct narratives that allow them to maintain plausible deniability about things they have actually observed or heard discussed, where they exploit the gap between direct personal witnessing and second-hand knowledge to claim that rumours and fragments of information do not constitute real knowledge that would require response. This motivated ignorance is a normal human psychological mechanism that operates in countless contexts, allowing people to ignore evidence of climate change or poverty or injustice, because acknowledging the evidence fully would require behavioural changes or moral commitments that feel too costly or too disruptive to ordinary life and comfort. The distinction between genuine ignorance and willful blindness is psychologically crucial because it reveals that complicity often does not require active enthusiasm or agreement with atrocity, but simply requires the decision to prioritize personal comfort and safety over moral courage and investigation of disturbing information. People who claimed after the war that they had not known what was happening to Jews were often technically accurate in claiming they had not witnessed the gas chambers or had not been told explicitly that systematic murder was occurring. Yet they were fundamentally dishonest in suggesting that they lacked sufficient information to understand that something catastrophic was happening, and that their silence and their continued participation in normal social and economic life was enabling that catastrophe to continue. The mechanisms through which millions of people justified their silence and their inaction operate through several overlapping psychological processes that researchers have identified and studied extensively in contexts ranging from bystander behavior during emergencies to organizational silence about unethical practices to collective failure to respond to obvious injustices. Conformity pressure makes it psychologically difficult to break with the consensus behavior of those around you, to speak up when everyone else is remaining silent. To act when doing so would mark you as different and potentially suspicious or disloyal. Because human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose sense of identity and worth is deeply tied to acceptance by their community and whose capacity for independent moral action is far more limited than individualistic ideologies suggest. The diffusion of responsibility that occurs in group contexts means that when many people are present or aware of a problem, each individual feels less personal obligation to respond because they assume that someone else will take action, or because the collective nature of the witnessing dilutes their sense that their particular silence or inaction makes any difference to outcomes. This psychological mechanism explains why bystanders often fail to intervene during emergencies, even when intervention would be relatively easy and safe, because each person is waiting for someone else to act first and is reassured by the inaction of others that perhaps no action is necessary or appropriate. Obedience to authority creates psychological pressure to defer to those in positions of power and to assume that they possess information or wisdom that justifies their decisions, and that questioning or resisting their directives would be inappropriate or dangerous, particularly in hierarchical societies where challenging authority has historically been punished and where social stability has been understood to depend on citizens accepting the legitimacy of those who govern them. The normalization of the abnormal occurs through gradual escalation, where each step toward atrocity seems only slightly worse than the previous step, and where the accumulation of small moral compromises gradually shifts the baseline of what seems acceptable or inevitable. making it psychologically difficult to identify the moment when you should have resisted, because each individual moment of escalation can be rationalized as not significantly different from what you have already accepted. The historical record preserves countless examples of moments when ordinary citizens encountered information or observations that should have triggered investigation or resistance, but that were instead rationalized or ignored or explained away through psychological mechanisms of motivated reasoning and selective attention. The systematic exclusion of Jews from public life through the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 and subsequent regulations occurred openly and was celebrated in newspapers and discussed in speeches and required the active participation of millions of Germans who stopped frequenting Jewish businesses and who adjusted their social relationships, and who accepted the premise that their Jewish neighbors and colleagues deserved exclusion and discrimination because of their racial identity. The Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938, when synagogues were burned and Jewish businesses were destroyed, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested throughout Germany, occurred as a public spectacle that required the participation or witnessing of thousands of citizens, and that could not possibly have been hidden from anyone living in affected communities. Yet the response of most Germans was not outrage or resistance, but rather acceptance or even approval, with many people participating in looting and violence or simply watching as their neighbours' lives were destroyed. The deportations that began systematically in 1941 occurred openly enough that neighbours and colleagues and friends witnessed Jews being forced from their homes and marched to train stations. Yet the response was typically silence and the rapid occupation of the apartments and appropriation of the possessions that the deported had been forced to leave behind. Soldiers returning from the Eastern Front brought with them first-hand accounts of mass shootings and atrocities committed against civilian populations. Information that spread through family networks and social circles, and that should have made clear to anyone paying attention that something far worse than forced resettlement was happening to Jews and other targeted populations. The smoke and smell from facilities operating near populated areas created physical evidence that could not be easily ignored or explained away. Yet residents developed elaborate rationalizations about industrial operations, or claimed that they had not really noticed or had assumed that what they were witnessing was less terrible than what was actually occurring. The crucial psychological and moral recognition that emerged from post-war examination of civilian complicity is that silence and inaction in the face of atrocity constitute forms of participation in that atrocity. That the distinction between active perpetrators and passive bystanders is less morally significant than comfortable narratives about individual responsibility would suggest. Because atrocity on the scale of genocide requires not just the active participation of those who directly commit violence, but also the passive cooperation of millions of people who maintain normal social and economic functioning while the violence is being committed, who continue to perform their jobs and fulfill their social roles and participate in the systems that make genocide logistically possible. The railway workers who transported deportees to camps were not typically motivated by anti-Semitic ideology or enthusiasm for genocide, but were simply doing their jobs and following orders and maintaining the routines that gave their lives structure and meaning. Yet their continued professional performance was absolutely necessary for the deportations to occur with the efficiency and scale that they achieved. The bureaucrats who processed paperwork and maintained records were typically not thinking about the ultimate consequences of their administrative work, but were focusing on their specific tasks and their professional competencies and their careers. Yet their meticulous documentation and processing made possible the identification and tracking and ultimate murder of millions of people. The neighbors who moved into emptied apartments, and the citizens who purchased confiscated possessions, and the workers who produced materials used in camps were all making individual decisions that seemed rational and perhaps even morally neutral when considered in isolation. Decisions to take advantage of opportunities presented to them, or to simply continue with their professional responsibilities, yet their collective choices to prioritize personal benefit and professional obligation over moral consideration of the broader system they were participating in, created the conditions that made genocide practically and psychologically possible. The psychological structures that allowed millions of people to maintain their sense of themselves as decent and moral individuals, while participating through silence and inaction in genocide, operated through comprehensive systems of rationalization and compartmentalization that kept them from confronting the full reality of what was happening and their role in enabling it. They told themselves that they were powerless to change anything, and that speaking up would accomplish nothing except endangering themselves and their families, a rationalization that conveniently absolved them of moral responsibility, while also being partly true in the sense that individual acts of resistance were indeed dangerous and unlikely to stop the systematic violence. They told themselves that they did not really know what was happening, and that rumors and fragments of information did not constitute the kind of certain knowledge that would create moral obligations to act. Exploiting the ambiguity and the deliberately euphemistic language that the regime used to discuss its policies, to maintain plausible deniability about things they had actually observed or heard discussed. They told themselves that the targeted populations must have done something to deserve their treatment, or that the authorities must have information justifying their actions, deferring moral judgment to those in positions of power, and assuming that their own discomfort or doubt reflected their lack of access to the full picture, rather than appropriate moral response to injustice. They focused on their immediate personal concerns and responsibilities, and allowed those to crowd out broader moral considerations, telling themselves that their duty was to protect their own families and to maintain their own livelihoods, and that they could not afford to sacrifice their personal security for abstract principles or for people outside their immediate circle of concern. They engaged in what psychologists call moral licensing, telling themselves that because they personally were not participating in violence and perhaps even felt sympathy for victims, they had fulfilled their moral obligations and that additional action was not required of them. The examination of how millions of ordinary people could know enough to be morally implicated while doing nothing to resist or even to privately oppose atrocity forces, confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human moral capacity and about the fragility of the ethical principles that we imagine govern our behavior when our comfort or safety are not at stake. The people who remained silent were not monsters or psychopaths or fundamentally different from human beings in other times and places. were not marked by obvious moral deficiencies that would allow us to categorize them as exceptions, whose choices tell us nothing about our own potential behavior under similar circumstances. They were ordinary people responding to social pressure and fear and the universal human tendency to prioritize personal concerns over abstract moral principles, to rationalize inaction through the observation that others are also inactive, to defer to authority rather than questioning its legitimacy, to focus on their immediate responsibilities rather than on the broader systems within which they operate. The psychological mechanisms that allowed their complicity remain active in human consciousness and continue to operate in contemporary contexts where injustice occurs within view of people who choose to look away, where systems of oppression are maintained through the passive cooperation of millions who tell themselves they are powerless or uninformed, or simply trying to live their lives without becoming involved in politics or controversies. The most dangerous people in history were not always the architects of atrocity or the direct perpetrators of violence, but rather the millions who looked away and who maintained normal life, and who told themselves that what was happening was none of their concern, or was beyond their power to influence, whose silence and whose continued participation in ordinary social and economic life provided the foundation upon which systematic violence could be built and sustained. The warning for contemporary societies is that similar mechanisms operate wherever injustice occurs in plain view, and wherever people possess enough information to know that something terrible is happening, but choose to rationalize their inaction through claims of ignorance, or powerlessness, or preoccupation with personal concerns. This has been forgotten minds. The question that remains is whether you would have been different, whether the psychological mechanisms that produced mass, complicit silence are things you have somehow transcended, or are instead vulnerabilities that remain present in your own consciousness, waiting to be activated when circumstances make moral courage costly, and when looking away seems easier than confronting what you know. Until next time, stay vigilant.